The first thing the people of Black Hollow heard was the dog screaming. Not barking, screaming. A raw, broken sound that tore through the midnight snow and rolled down from the ridge above the village, where the abandoned church stood among dead yew trees and rusted iron. Curtains shifted. Lamps flickered on behind frosted glass. But no one opened a door. No one in Black Hollow was foolish enough to step outside when a sound like that came from the hill, because everyone knew what stood up there. And everyone knew that if the Hollow Church ever called something inside, it did not always give it back. Mrs. Wren saw it happen from behind her bedroom curtain. The stray dog stood frozen at the chapel gate, ribs heaving, yellow eyes fixed on the dark beyond the broken fence. Then, slowly, soundlessly, the church doors opened. No wind, no footsteps, no light from within. Just a slit in the dark, widening like a mouth. The dog tried to run, but something black slid out from the doorway, thin as smoke and fast as a striking snake. It wrapped around the animal's body, lifted it clean off the ground, and dragged it screaming into the church. A second later, the doors shut, and the whole village went silent, as if Black Hollow itself had stopped breathing. By morning, the snow beneath the gate was smooth again. No tracks, no blood, no sign that anything had happened at all. Mrs. Wren stood in her kitchen with both hands around a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the ridge through gray dawn light and trying to convince herself she had imagined it. Age did strange things to the eyes. Fear did worse. Yet when she raised the cup to her lips, her fingers were still trembling. The dog was found just before sunrise. It lay at the bottom of the hill, curled on its side as if it had simply gone to sleep and forgotten to wake. Its fur had turned completely white, not silver with frost, not pale with age. White to the root, as though every trace of color had been bled from it during the night. Its mouth hung open, its eyes were wide with a terror so naked that the milkman who discovered it first crossed himself before he even realized he was doing it. By noon, half the village had heard about the dog, and by evening, the story had already begun changing shape. Some said it had been sick, some said it had frozen, some said it was never found at all. Black Hollow had long practice in the art of not seeing what it did not wish to see. Men in the butchers spoke too loudly about weather and livestock. Women at the grocer's discussed Christmas cakes and coal deliveries. At the pub, the landlord dried the same glass for 5 minutes straight while pretending not to hear the ridge mentioned from the corner table. But fear once stirred as a way of leaking through cracks. That night, Mrs. Wren heard the bell. Only once. A deep, low toll that seemed to rise through the snow rather than across it. Her kitchen spoons trembled inside their drawer. She stood frozen beside the sink, listening. The bell did not ring again. Then came a knock at her back door. One knock, a pause, then another. Mrs. Wren did not move. The cottage stood alone. No neighbor would have crossed that path in weather like this, and none would have knocked so softly. She stared at the dark window above the sink until her eyes watered, and waited for a third knock that never came. In the morning, there were no footprints in the snow, only a black smear across the wood, long and finger-shaped, as though someone had rested a soot-covered hand against the door and then thought better of asking to enter. 3 nights later, a university coach rolled into Black Hollow under a sky the color of old steel. It had come from London, packed with architecture students sent north for a winter field program on historic religious sites. They arrived tired, overlayered, unimpressed, and loudly skeptical of the village they found waiting for them. Their hotel sat on the edge of town, respectable but faded, with floral wallpaper, narrow staircases, and staff who smiled too quickly whenever guests asked about the ridge above the trees. The rules were repeated twice at dinner: no wandering after dark, curfew at 9, stay in groups, inform a professor before leaving the property. To the faculty, these sounded like precautions. To 20-year-olds, they sounded like a dare. At 11:13 that night, 3 students slipped out through the side entrance and into the cold. Ethan Cole led the way, hands in his pockets, grin already in place. He had the kind of face people trusted too quickly, and the kind of confidence that only existed because consequences had never yet made themselves personal. Lucas Reed came after him, phone torch on before they had reached the lane. Lucas called himself curious, though most of what passed for curiosity in him was simply the belief that nothing bad ever really happened to people like him. Aarav Singh came last. He had said almost nothing since dinner. Black Hollow had unsettled him from the moment they arrived. It was not one thing he could point to, but a collection of small absences. No children playing in the lanes after dusk. No dogs barking once the sun dropped behind the pines. No one in the village ever looking directly at the ridge for more than a second at a time. His grandmother had been the sort of woman who believed houses could remember and roads could go bad. Aarav had spent most of his life politely dismissing such beliefs. Yet standing in Black Hollow, with the winter air cutting through his coat and the church watching from above the village, he found those old warnings returning to him with unpleasant clarity. They climbed the road between sleeping cottages, their boots crushing fresh snow. Lucas joked about the professors. Ethan joked about the locals. Aarav tried once to suggest they turn back before someone noticed they were gone. Ethan only pointed through the pines. There it was. The church stood on the ridge above them, all broken Gothic lines and shadowed stone. Its bell tower was cracked. One side of the roof had caved in under years of neglect. The iron fence that surrounded it leaned inward, as if trying to keep itself from running away. In moonlight, it looked almost beautiful. Almost. But beauty was not the first thing Aarav felt. The place looked wrong. Not ruined, not empty. Wrong. As if the church existed at a slight angle to the rest of the world, and everything around it had learned to keep its distance. Ethan shoved the rusted gate. It opened with a metallic shriek that seemed far too loud for the stillness around them. No birds startled from the trees. No wind answered. Even the night seemed to hold itself back. "We can come tomorrow in daylight," Aarav said quietly. "With Professor Hayes lecturing us about stained arches," Lucas muttered. "Hard pass." They climbed the final stretch of path. With every step, the cold sharpened. Aarav rubbed the steel care on his wrist, a bracelet his grandmother had given him before university. For remembrance, she had said. For protection. He wore it more out of habit than belief, yet now, touching it brought a small, stubborn steadiness to his chest. At the top of the hill, the chapel doors stood slightly open. Lucas lowered his phone. "Hasn't this place been abandoned for decades?" "Looks like someone forgot to lock up," Ethan said. He stepped inside. The others followed. The smell hit first. Damp timber, rot, old wax, and beneath it all, something sour and powdery, like ashes stirred by rain. Their torch beams slid over collapsed pews, torn hymnals, hanging webs, cracked statues with their faces weathered away. The altar crouched beneath a vast crucifix blackened by time. Across the stone floor ran long, deep grooves that did not look like age had made them. They looked cut, scraped, dragged into being. Aarav's throat tightened. Then the rafters exploded. Bats tore downward in a shrieking black storm, slapping against shoulders and hair before spiraling through the doorway and out into the night. Lucas cursed and ducked. Ethan laughed too loudly. "Just bats," he said. Aarav stared upward into the dark beams. "No," he whispered. "Something frightened them." His own voice sounded strange in the chapel, swallowed too fast, as though the air did not want to carry human sound. Lucas knelt beside one of the grooves near the altar and ran his fingers over the stone. "These aren't decorative," he murmured. "They look like claw marks." Aarav stepped back and nearly cried out. Something had tightened around his ankle. He yanked his leg free and swung the torch downward. A length of old rope lay across the aisle. Nothing more. Ethan turned, saw his face, and laughed again. "Mate, you nearly died of yarn." Aarav said nothing, because he knew, with the awful private certainty of the frightened, that the rope had not been still a second ago. Then every light in the church came on. Weak yellow bulbs blinked awake along the walls. Tarnished chandeliers trembled overhead, spreading a sickly light across the ruined nave. Lucas shot to his feet so fast he nearly dropped his phone. That's impossible. There should have been no power. The lights flickered. On, off, on, off. Each darkness lasted longer than the last, and in those brief black gaps, the chapel seemed to change. The aisles stretched, the corners deepened, pews appeared where none had been before, shadows shifted with intention. "We're leaving," Aarav said. For once, no one argued. They ran to the entrance. The doors were shut. Ethan slammed his shoulder against them. Lucas grabbed the handles and pulled until his palms slipped. The wood did not move. "It was open," Lucas said, and his voice was beginning to shake. Ethan pounded the panels. "Very funny. Open the damn door." The lights died. Only the phone torches remained, their beams thin and unsteady in the dark. Then Lucas whispered, "Don't turn around." Aarav turned around. A nun stood halfway down the aisle. There had been no footsteps, no sound. She had not walked into view. She was simply there, as if the darkness had shaped itself into a woman. Her habit hung in burned strips. The hem looked charred. Her skin was the color of drowned wax stretched over bone. Her lips were split at the corners. Her eyes were not merely red. They looked flayed, wet, fresh, lit from somewhere behind by a pain that had never ended. She tilted her head. Something cracked in her neck. Ethan's breath caught. "What the hell is that?" The nun smiled. Then her body collapsed into black smoke. Something hit the floor behind them with a scraping rush. Ethan shouted. Aarav's light swung just in time to see him convulse and drop hard to his hands and knees. His limbs jerked, his body crawled forward too quickly, elbows bending wrong. When he looked up, his skin had gone corpse pale. His eyes shone raw red in the torchlight. Lucas backed into a pew. "Ethan?" Ethan's mouth opened. For an instant, Aarav saw two faces flickering there, Ethan's and something older, female, ravenous, wearing his features like a badly fitted mask. Then Ethan lunged. He hit Lucas with impossible force and drove him to the floor. Lucas let out a strangled cry as Ethan's hands clamped around his throat. Steam rose where skin touched skin. A voice whispered through the chapel walls. "You entered a house that was sealed." The nun formed again beside the altar, darker now, almost solid. Frost spread from her bare feet across the stone. "You woke what was bound to hunger." Aarav forced sound past his terror. "Who are you?" Her split mouth widened. "Sister Miriam." The chandeliers began to sway above them. "They shut me inside with prayer and fire," she whispered. "They sang psalms while something in this place fed on my breath, my blood, my faith. By dawn, I was no longer a servant of God." Her gaze dropped to Aarav's wrist. "You wear old prayer." She drifted toward him, metal remembered by blessing. Her fingers brushed the kara. The reaction was instant. A scream ripped through the church so sharply, Aarav felt it in his teeth. Sister Miriam flew backward as if struck and crashed into a pew hard enough to split it apart. Smoke rose from her hand. Aarav stared at the bracelet. Lucas's movements were weakening beneath Ethan's grip. Without thinking, Aarav tore the kara from his own wrist and shoved it over Ethan's hand. Ethan convulsed. A scream burst from him in two voices at once, his own and Miriam's, layered together in something so unnatural that Lucas tried to crawl away from it and nearly fainted from lack of air. A column of blackness tore from Ethan's chest and recoiled upward like smoke pulled by a violent draft. Ethan collapsed beside Lucas, twitching once before going limp. Lucas rolled over, dragging breath into bruised lungs. But Sister Miriam rose again, and now she looked stronger, angrier. The stained glass windows rattled, cracks spidered across them. Somewhere above, the ruined bell began to toll. One deep strike, then another. No rope moved in the tower. Sister Miriam glided toward Aarav, her wound-red eyes burning. "You should have fled when the dog screamed." Aarav backed away until his hand struck metal. A ceremonial blade hung crookedly on a rotten stand near the wall, tarnished with age. Decorative once, real enough now. He grabbed it because there was nothing else left. Lucas, still coughing, whispered, "Aarav." The nun came at him, fast as smoke in a chimney. Aarav thrust the blade forward on instinct. It entered her chest. For one impossible second, everything stopped. Then black fluid spilled around the metal and hissed on the floor like acid. Sister Miriam convulsed, mouth opening wider and wider until it seemed her jaw must split. Dust rained from the rafters, statues trembled. The crucifix above the altar shook against the wall. Still, she smiled. "Courage," she whispered, voice bubbling through shadow, "is not salvation." Aarav stumbled backward, breath tearing in and out of him. Ethan lay motionless. Lucas could barely sit upright. The wound in Miriam's chest smoked, but it did not close. And in that moment, looking at her, Aarav understood something terrible. They were not surviving this. Fear stripped everything else from him. Pride, reason, any need to understand. He looked up at the blackened crucifix and shouted into the ruined church, "I don't know your prayers. I don't know your rites. But if anything holy is still in this place, help us." Silence fell. A silence so complete, it hurt. Then the chapel blazed, not with electric light, with something vast and golden and living. Radiance burst from behind the altar, pouring through the cracks in the stone, flooding the nave, setting every dead candlewick alight without flame. Frost vanished from the floor. The black crucifix flared white-hot. Sister Miriam screamed and dropped to her knees. And from the heart of the light stepped 3 figures. A priest in old vestments untouched by decay. 2 nuns clothed in white. Their faces were calm, luminous, sorrowful. They did not move like ghosts. They moved like memory restored. The priest looked at the thing kneeling before him. "Miriam," he said. At the sound of her name, the hatred in her face faltered. "They left me here," she whispered. The priest bowed his head. Yes. No denial, no excuse, only grief. "We failed you." One of the white-clad nuns knelt beside Lucas and touched his throat. The bruising softened beneath her hand. The other placed her palm over Ethan's chest, and he convulsed violently before dragging in a breath like a drowning man reaching air. Aarav stood frozen, tears cold on his face. The priest lifted an aspergillum and scattered shining droplets across Sister Miriam's body. Steam rose in silver threads. Then he began to pray, not loudly, but with a mercy so deep it seemed to move through the stones themselves. The blackness in Miriam's wound thinned. The burns on her habit faded. The raw red of her eyes dimmed to human brown. The monstrous strain of her mouth softened. For one brief, devastating moment, she looked simply young. Young, exhausted, and terribly afraid. "I was so cold," she whispered. The priest stepped closer. "You may rest now." Miriam turned her face toward Aarav. There was gratitude there, and shame, and a release so vast it was almost unbearable to watch. Then her body dissolved into white light. The light rose slowly through the nave, touched the crucifix, and vanished within it. The bell stopped. The wind fell silent, and the hollow church exhaled. The priest turned to Aarav. "Because you stood where others would have broken," he said softly, "the bound have been led home." Lucas blinked like a man waking from fever. Ethan looked around in confusion, already losing hold of what had happened. Aarav felt it too, that strange loosening, as if the night were beginning to slide out of memory even while he stood inside it. "By morning," the priest said, "they will remember very little. Sometimes forgetting is mercy." His gaze rested on Aarav. "You may remember longer. That is the price of witness." Behind them, the chapel doors opened on a sky paling with dawn. The 3 students stumbled into the cold blue snow. Aarav turned back once. For a single heartbeat, the church stood whole. No ruined roof, no broken tower, no black stains. Warm candlelight glowed behind stained glass. The stone was clean, the bell tower straight. It looked as it must have looked before terror made a home in it. Then the vision trembled, and the ruin returned. At breakfast, Ethan remembered a nightmare and a fall. Lucas remembered getting lost on the ridge and panicking in the dark. Neither could explain the bruises around Lucas's throat or the ring-shaped burn on Ethan's hand. Both laughed too hard about it, the way people do when standing too close to something their minds refuse to hold. Aarav said very little. He sat near the hotel window with untouched toast on his plate and watched the ridge through the glass. Once or twice he was sure he heard the faint echo of a bell, though no one else reacted. When the coach left Black Hollow that afternoon, snow had begun to fall again. The village receded behind them, slate roofs, thin chimneys, frozen lanes, the ridge beyond the trees. Aarav pressed his forehead to the cold window as they rounded the final bend. There was no church, no chapel, only snow, pines, and a rusted gate standing alone in an empty field. Beside it stood the priest, still as a grave marker, one hand raised in blessing. A single drop of cold water touched Aarav's brow, though the glass remained unbroken. At once, the details began to loosen. The red eyes faded first, then the bell, then the black smoke in the blade and the terrible sound of Ethan screaming in two voices. Even the name, Miriam, slipped away from him like breath from glass. By the time the mountains had disappeared behind the coach, only one certainty remained inside him, hard as iron and old as prayer. Something had lived in the hollow church, and something holier had finally led it home. For years afterward, Aarav told himself that was enough. He graduated, moved south, built a careful life out of deadlines, rent, city trains, and the manageable noise of ordinary days. Sometimes, in the middle of winter, he would wake with frost in his lungs and the fading sensation of bells somewhere beyond sleep. Sometimes his wrist would ache where the Kara had once sat before he lost it on that hill. He never replaced it. He did not speak of Black Hollow, not to Ethan, who had developed an odd aversion to churches and could never explain why. Not to Lucas, who flinched whenever anyone touched his throat unexpectedly, and certainly not to himself. Then, 11 years later, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single folded page and a photograph. The page contained only one sentence. "It is standing there again." The photograph showed a ridge under winter sky, a rusted gate, dead yew trees, and beyond them, unmistakable even in blurred gray print, the outline of a church that should no longer have existed. Aarav stared at the image for a long time before he realized his hands were shaking. By dusk, he was on a train north. He told no one where he was going. Black Hollow had changed less than it should have. The petrol station at the crossroads was gone. The pub had new paint. A few cottages had modern windows that looked wrong in old stone. But the air felt the same, sharp, watchful, thin, with something waiting just beneath it. Mrs. Wren was dead. He learned that from the woman now keeping the hotel desk, who said it casually, as if discussing weather. The old hotel manager was gone too. Most of the faces in the village were unfamiliar. But not all. The landlord at the pub was still there, older now, heavier around the middle, with the same careful eyes. He recognized Aarav at once. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the landlord set down the glass he was drying and said quietly, "You should have stayed away." Aarav felt the old cold move through him. "I got a letter." The landlord nodded as if he had expected that. "You were always going to." "Why?" The man glanced toward the darkened window behind Aarav, toward the ridge beyond the village. "Because some places don't forget the people who saw them clearly." Aarav swallowed. "I thought it was over." "So did we." The landlord poured him a whiskey he had not asked for. "3 nights ago," he said, "the bell rang again." Aarav did not touch the drink. Outside, snow had begun falling in soft white threads. Has anyone gone up there? The landlord looked at him for so long that Aarav already knew the answer before it came. A girl from the village, he said, 17. She went missing at dusk yesterday. Her mother found footprints in the snow leading to the ridge. He paused, only going up. The room seemed to contract around Aarav. He thought of the dog, of the black doorway, of a voice inside stone whispering that hunger had been woken. That church was cleansed, he said, though the words sounded weak to his own ears. The landlord's gaze dropped to Aarav's bare wrist. Was it? Silence pressed between them. From somewhere outside, far off and low, a bell began to toll. Once, then again. The landlord closed his eyes. Aarav turned slowly toward the window. Above the village, between the shifting pines and falling snow, a pale light had appeared on the ridge. Not moonlight, not a lantern. A thin, golden glow from behind broken stained glass. The hollow church was standing there again, and this time, Aarav understood the thing he had spent 11 years refusing to name. Some evils do not die. Some mercies do not end. And some doors, once opened, wait with all the patience of the dead for the one person foolish enough or chosen enough to walk back through them. Aarav rose. The landlord did not try to stop him. Neither man spoke as the bell continued to toll above the village, slow and deep and hungry. At the pub door, Aarav paused. "Do you remember it?" he asked. The landlord looked into his glass. "Only when it wants me to." Aarav stepped into the snow. The cold struck him like recognition. Above Black Hollow, the church waited, and somewhere inside its lightless heart, something had begun to call again.